Yep. Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for joining us. Happy Friday the 13th. My name is James Grant. I am the Customer Success Manager here at iMeasureU. For those of you that don't know what iMeasureU is we're a lower limb load monitoring solution for rehab and return to play. And today we have the 7th webinar, I believe, in our series, and it's a special one because we have 3 panelists instead of 1. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So if you have any questions as the presentation is going on, there is that Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions at any time, let us know there, and at the end we'll have a question and answer portion where we can hopefully get through all of them. You will be sent a recording at the end of this webinar, so if you have to leave early, you'll get that probably tomorrow whenever it's done processing. And then at the end, you'll be directed to the example dashboard, which you'll have free access to if you're interested in playing around with the metrics at all. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. So we have Jeremy Outerlays, Caleb Johnson, and Julie Berlin. Their background spans the biomechanical evaluation of running-related and lower extremity injuries, musculoskeletal injury prevention in both military and sporting populations, and the application of neuromuscular control on functional performance after lower extremity injuries. Thanks for that intro, guys. A lot of the longest words I could think of, so I'm glad I didn't stumble over those. Jeremy, Caleb, and Julie all have interest in the use of wearable sensors to identify changes in running behaviors, identify individuals potentially at risk for injury, and the sensors used in longitudinal monitoring of athletes in order to enhance clinical decision-making. So I believe Caleb's up first, so I'll hand it over to him and let him get started.
All right, thank you, James. There we go. So I'm just going to start out just by really briefly talking about the mission of the Spaulding National Running Center, where we all work. So the center is an integrated research lab and clinic. The clinic treats injured runners primarily, obviously, with overuse musculoskeletal injuries. And so the general, kind of broad perspective mission of the center is to try to limit the number of lower extremity overuse musculoskeletal injuries, and primarily in runners. Some of the main focuses of our research work at the lab have to do with identifying factors related to running mechanics and footwear. Those are our 2 primary areas we're interested in that relate to injury, and then effective methods of kind of altering, especially running mechanics, optimizing running mechanics to help limit, obviously, the occurrence of injuries. And then just a standard disclaimer, I just wanted to say that none of us are receiving any payment or compensation for putting on this webinar, and none of us have any conflicts of interest to report. We obviously use iMeasureU sensors. You'll hear that throughout the presentation, and we like them, but I guess just that we come by those opinions honestly. All right, and so the portion I'm going to talk about is the Boston Marathon study that was conducted at the Spaulding National Running Center. I first wanted to just start out by being really clear that I actually started at the lab after this study was completed. So the first part of my talk is going to be about some of the methodological and logistical considerations around the study, some of the lessons learned. And so I want to make it clear that all the hard work that went into planning and conducting this study was what came from these individuals, not from myself. A lot of those considerations I'm just kind of speaking on behalf of them. And I'm going to use the term we a lot because that's how we always, it's the common language for talking about a study, but what really I mean they when I talk about those things. All right, so just to start with, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're interested in tibial accelerations, because this is the main measure that we took across for the Boston Marathon study. And generally, tibial accelerations we measure using either an accelerometer or an inertial measurement unit, which contains an accelerometer. And the most common site that it's attached is the distal medial tibia, generally right over top of the tibia and just above the medial malleolus. And the main reason that we're interested in this measure is because we think it gives us a pretty good surrogate for the overall gross external load being placed on the lower extremities during running. And this is because it has shown pretty strong correlations with early stance ground reaction forces. To the right here, there's a little bit of data from our lab showing that correlation. And there's been a number of authors who have reported similar correlations as well. This is true for vertical accelerations, which are along the y-axis here, as well as resultant accelerations, which can, in easy terms, be thought of as the sum of accelerations along the x, y, and z axes. And then just again, to be really clear that these have shown strong correlations to ground reaction force measures, specifically during running. So then second, why are we so interested in these measures? Because, if the primary reason we're interested is because it's a pretty good surrogate of ground reaction force measures, it begs the question, why not just measure ground reaction forces? And I think most of you probably know the primary reason is that IMUs offer the ability to collect data autonomously outside of the lab in whatever you want to call it, an outdoor environment, natural, real world, free moving, whatever the term is. It essentially allows us to collect some measure of general external loading to lower extremities in a more ecologically valid way. Despite this, most of the research prior to the Boston Marathon study had utilized these sensors in an indoor laboratory environment. So that was the main impetus for the study. Generally, that we wanted to start looking at when we take these sensors outside and collect data during real world running, what kind of effects do we see that we might not see in the lab? And so overall, the study included 254 runners. They were participants in the 2016 Boston Marathon. The general flow of subjects through the study looks like this diagram below here. So essentially, participants completed a baseline session where they came to the race expo, and we had a room set up to collect data at the expo. We collected tibial accelerations on a treadmill, as well as some video of foot strike pattern. Then they also received their sensor for race day and instructions on how to use it. Prior to the race, they attached their sensor and turned it on. During the race, we collected continuous triaxial accelerations at 1,000 hertz. And then after the race, we collected the sensors again at the finish line, obviously to get the data back. And so getting into some of the methodological and logistical considerations, again, with a study of this size, this many participants collected over a relatively short period of time, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. And again, I want to make sure it's the individuals who were at the lab prior to me, and some of them are still there, obviously, who were responsible for all of that hard work. So prior to the baseline sessions, it was really important to get the approval and buy-in of the Boston Athletic Association. Beyond the fact that you're not allowed to recruit runners that are participating in the race without their approval, it was important for recruitment because they sent out recruitment notices through their newsletter. And I'm not really sure there's a feasible way to identify runners for the marathon, at least on a mass scale, without that. We also had to reserve a room at the convention center, obviously for the baseline session during their expo. And that really helped limit the subject burden for getting the baseline measures of both foot strike pattern and tibial accelerations. So being able to have the runners come in just whenever they came to pick up their stuff anyway at the expo center. And then finally, to have access to the finish line to be able to get the sensors back directly after the race to make that easier, we had to have approval from BAA as well. During the baseline session, a big consideration was participant flow, because obviously we were collecting a lot of participants over a relatively short time period, just about 3 days and about 250 participants. So we did around 84 a day. One of the things that helped with that was having time slots where the participants signed up to come, and that just helped with knowing when people would be there and how many we would have at a time, and things like that. Also having multiple stations set up to help different components that we needed from them to get them through quicker. We had a station for informed consent, and just going over the details of the study. One where they got their sensor that they would use for race day and then received instructions on how to use it. And then finally, one where we collected measures while they ran on the treadmill. And then finally, it's just important to think about all the staffing you need for collecting that many participants in that short of a time period. not only just to fill, all the stations to get subjects through quickly, but also, there's a lot of burnout if you're collecting for that many hours a day. So you have to make sure people can get breaks and stuff. And then finally, for the baseline session, I think one of the most important considerations was providing really good, detailed, easy to follow instructions on attaching and tightening the sensor on race day, because obviously your data quality depends pretty heavily on that. So we basically gave them 3 marks to help with this. The first was for strap tightness. So we figured out what was a good strap tightness, which we sort of, subjectively defined as being tight and snug, so that the data quality is very good, but not overly tight where it would be uncomfortable for them. And then we made a mark on the strap that's pictured on the top right here, and that just helped them replicate that same tightness when they put it on in the next couple days for the race. Placement, we made a mark on the skin so that they knew exactly where to place it, and again, the placement would be the same between baseline and the race conditions. And then the orientation of the sensor we made really easy by just marking the top of the sensor so they knew which way to orient it on the leg. And then finally, starting the sensor, we obviously just told them how to start the sensor. And for the version of iMeasureU sensors that we use, it was really easy. You just flip the little switch down here. And actually, as soon as you flip that switch, the sensor started recording, which made it really easy on the subjects. So it's something to think about if you're looking to do a study that's similar to this, is that some sensors do require an external app that you have to connect to the sensor and then use that to start data collection. And so that's something that might just add some extra subject burden or some confusion for them with being able to use the sensors by themselves. All right, so on race day, despite all those considerations, we did end up having a couple issues that I'm going to go over really quickly. So the first was with strap tightness. So we set the strap tightness under relatively controlled environmental conditions. And then on race day, it was actually a fairly hot and humid day. And so you got some natural swelling and edema of the leg with that. And then also, obviously, as runners progress through the race, you get some exercise-induced edema. And so we ended up having some issues with the strap being too tight, even though we had set it to the, the right tightness at baseline. And so along with that, some people reported that the sensor was chafing their leg as they moved through as they ran through the race. And so we had about 18 subjects that we lost data for because they had to either loosen or remove their sensor. The second thing is we had just a couple small issues with the data recording or not saving on the sensors. And I think the biggest point with that is that it was only 9 out of 250. And so if you think about the amount of data loss you expect with a study of this size, with any other piece of equipment, that's fairly small. That's a fairly small number. So it's just, the point, I guess, is that IMUs are generally pretty reliable pieces of equipment. And then lastly, there were just a couple subjects who decided not to wear the sensor on race day for whatever reason. They changed their mind and just didn't wear it. And then the last thing is collecting sensors at the end of the race. So like I mentioned, we collected the majority of them at the finish line, and we let the runners know that we would be at the finish line. And you can see we had little areas set up with signs so they knew where to go, and the staff were pretty diligent about, grabbing the runners and getting the sensors off them. But at the end of a marathon, the last thing on a runner's mind is probably what they should do with the sensor on their leg. They might not even remember that they have it on. And so there were some that we didn't get the sensors back from. And to handle this, we actually gave everyone a pre-stamped envelope at the baseline session. And so those that didn't return it, we just emailed them and they sent it back through the mail. That made that easy. All right, so some considerations for data processing or handling the data post-race. The first big one is the operating range of the sensor. So this just really easily is essentially the highest acceleration your sensor is capable of recording. And there's usually some trade-off between resolution and operating range. And so as many of you may know, if you get peaks in your accelerations that exceed the operating range, so if we imagine this red line on the right here is the operating range, essentially the sensor will just clip those peaks off at the end of the range. And the operating range on the Blue Thunder sensors, the ones that we use, was 16 Gs. So we did get some issues with clipped peaks, about 14% of the total strides we had clipped peaks for. And there's a couple of easy ways to deal with this. We use an interpolation method where we just used a couple points on either side of the peak to estimate where that peak would have been if it hadn't have been clipped. And we found that this was a pretty accurate way to, to handle that. The mean error in those interpolated peaks was less than 0.1 Gs. But it's also, it's worth just considering, to make it easy on yourself to get a sensor that has an adequate operating range to cover the activities that you plan on measuring. And with the newest sensors from iMeasure, that's pretty easy because their range is 200 Gs. All right, the second kind of big thing was handling artifact, or if you will, bad peaks. So these can come from a number of sources. One of the most common ones, at least during runner, is the sensor getting knocked against the opposite leg. And that can give you just an artificially high peak, one that's not, indicative of real data. The second, at least for us, was the peak detection method. So depending on how you're defining your windows to take peaks from, you can sometimes cut off a peak early, and then you'll get artificially low peaks. And so this brings up a good point with having tons of data. It can be a big hurdle to figure out how to handle data quality, right? So this is what it looks like when you collect over 2 hours of accelerometer data. You have just this whole mess of peaks. We know that each little slice of this graph, there's thousands of these peaks that we're identifying, and that we want to then make sure that there's no bad ones in there. And there's several methods to kind of handle this. One of the most common ways is just to use a moving mean or median, plus or minus some measure of variance, and use that as a threshold, and just throw out all the peaks that are above or below that, just consider them bad. And I know that sounds kind of like using a blunt instrument, because you have no real way to check whether you're throwing out bad peaks or good peaks. But that brings up the other point about having tons of data, is that it's also a big advantage. So if you're, averaging these peaks over a kilometer, which is thousands of strides, then throwing out 60 good peaks by mistake really isn't that big of an issue, right? All right, so that's some of the methodological and logistical considerations that went into the study and processing after the study. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the data that I was involved with analyzing. And the main question of this manuscript that we recently published in MSSE was, are we adequately capturing what a runner's external load profile looks like during outdoor free running when we take those measures on a treadmill indoors? And so just starting out, these are mean differences between the treadmill values, again, that we collected at that baseline session at the expo. And then 3 different points across the race, the 12th, 23rd, and 40th kilometer. And so we found overall that mean tibial accelerations were higher during the race compared to the treadmill. And that was true for both vertical and resultant accelerations, and for almost every point of the race, except I've actually marked here with the red bar the one that wasn't significantly different. So that was for vertical tibial accelerations and with the 40-kilometer stage of the race. And then also we found that mean tibial accelerations decreased significantly as runners progressed through the race. And then second, these are correlations between the treadmill measures and again, obviously the different stages of the marathon race. And there were 2 points I wanted to make with the correlations. The first is that you can see that the correlations are relatively the same between resultant and vertical tibial accelerations. And also that they're relatively the same no matter what point in the race you're looking at. And that's actually a little bit counter to what we thought. We thought that potentially the correlations would decrease, as runners fatigue through the race and their movement patterns got more variable. The second point is that you can obviously tell that there's some sort of relationship between these 2 conditions, between tibial accelerations and these 2 conditions. But the overall amount of variance explained in outdoor measures by treadmill measures is only 40%. And that's pretty much the same no matter what point in the race you look at. And so, for our interpretation, there's a lot of unexplained variance left when you measure someone indoors and in a lab. If you're trying to capture what they're going to look like when they run by themselves outside. So that takes me to the first main takeaway, at least from these analyses, is that we're not at least from our interpretation, we're not adequately capturing typical tibial accelerations for a runner when we capture them indoors and on a treadmill. And there was actually a really nice paper by Claire Milner. It came out around the same time as ours. And she found the same thing, and she actually looked at some different conditions as well. So she looked at non-race conditions, and then also for indoor, she looked at overground running, and for outdoor, she looked at running on a grass surface as well as asphalt. And she found essentially the same thing that we did, no matter what conditions you looked at. The outdoor tibial accelerations were significantly higher on average, and the amount of variance it was actually weird. Her R-squared values were almost the exact same as ours. Again, no matter what condition you looked at. The second main takeaway from our interpretation is that some of the effects that we have demonstrated in controlled laboratory conditions may not hold in the real world. And a good example of this is that a lot of laboratory studies have found increased vertical ground reaction forces or tibial accelerations with fatigue. So at the end of fatigue protocol compared to baseline. And our results show the opposite. So we show that as runners progress through the marathon race, so as we expect they're fatiguing in some capacity, it's a marathon, that their mean tibial accelerations decrease. And part of one of the biggest reasons we think for this is that their mean speed decreased as well across the race, which makes sense. But that's sort of the point, is that when you have someone in a free running real world environment, they can make adjustments based on fatigue that if you have them in a laboratory completing a fatigue protocol that requires them to stay at the same speed for the entire protocol, they can't. And so potentially we're artificially inducing some of those effects that we find in a laboratory environment. And it just highlights, the nice thing about being able to use IMUs and start to try to capture some of these variables outdoors. And so before I turn it over to Julie, I just wanted to mention that there's another paper with some of the data from this study by Matt Reuter that was published in MSSC in 2019. And their analyses looked at essentially just differences in tibial accelerations between runners with different foot strike patterns across the race. All right, and so I'll turn it over to Julie now.
Thanks, Caleb. Just bear with me. All right, so as Caleb has discussed so far, a large focus of the center that we have been looking at has been focused around IMUs during indoor and outdoor running. And really, he highlighted the utility of being able to use IMUs out in the field or in the real world environment to get a more ecologically valid sense of what is actually going on during these activities. So for us, the next natural extension was going to be using IMUs during team-based sports such as soccer or basketball. And so, when looking into moving IMUs from runners into team sports, a lot of the research on tibial-mounted IMUs had been conducted in running and in runners. And these sensors have been shown to be able to reliably measure impact load metrics, again, during both indoor and outdoor running. But there was not that much information on the reliability of these specific sensors for capturing impact load type metrics during other functional movements or other sporting activities. And so what our original plan was pre-COVID was to extend the use of our IMUs to a team-based sport where we could monitor a team of high school soccer athletes across a season and look at how those impact loads might change throughout the duration of the season. But before we could undertake this team monitoring strategy study, we wanted to determine the reliability of the IMUs that we wanted to use in actually being able to estimate impact load across some more functional and multi-directional tasks. And so to do this, we brought in 10 healthy recreational soccer players. All of these players and participants must have either been currently involved in soccer or had previously played in some capacity in the past. And what we had these individuals do is come in 3 different times, and these sessions spanned 7 to 10 days so that we had a decent amount of space between our sessions. And all of the test sessions were performed on an outdoor grass field. And what we did was to actually secure the IMUs, We used a soft athletic overwrap and then a self-adhesive kind of coverall to affix the IMU to the distal medial tibia right above the medial malleolus. And the reason why we decided to affix the IMUs this way, they do come with a strap that you can use. However, when we were thinking about the team monitoring study, we were concerned with the equipment that soccer players might wear, what type of shin guards they might be using, whether they're the shin guards that have the stirrup and the ankle pads, or whether or not they were the shin guards that kind of slip into a nice sleeve. And so what we wanted to do was make a really low profile and flexible attachment that was comfortable, that could be worn under different types of equipment. And so during each of our 3 sessions, we had the subjects perform 4 specific movement tasks, and we chose 4 movement tasks that really depicted things that soccer players normally do, they normally perform. So we had them perform an acceleration and deceleration movement where they accelerated as fast as they could to a cone and then decelerated. We had them perform a plant and cut task, as well as quick changes of direction tasks, because, again, that's common in soccer. And then, of course, we included a ball kicking task. And so what we did was we collected cumulative impact load and the number of steps that were taken during each of these tasks. And when we had these subjects, complete them, the order of the tasks was randomized for each participant, and they completed them in the same order across the 3 sessions. And once we had all of the data, we processed the data using iMeasureU's IMU STEP platform, and Jeremy is going to talk a little bit more in depth about kind of the logistics regarding those steps. So the first thing that we looked at was cumulative impact load. And so when we upload the data into IMU STEP, it calculates cumulative impact load by taking the number of steps and multiplying it by the intensity at which those steps are taken. So it's a nice clean equation, and gives us a nice output of the impact load that occurs over the course of the movement and the session. And secondly, we looked at the number of steps, and this is just the steps that are summed per limb across the movements. And you can see the left is represented in blue and the right is represented in orange. And so we averaged our outcome variables across. We had each participant do 3 trials of each task, and then we performed interclass correlation coefficients across the 3 test sessions to make sure that the IMUs were actually measuring the same thing each time. And so what we found was that overall the ICC values for our impact load metrics were good to excellent, which was great. We were really happy to see that. And then when we looked more specifically into right, left, and total step count, the ICC values were also good to excellent, specifically during the acceleration, deceleration, change of direction, and plant and cut maneuver. What we did find was that the step count reliability values were only fair to good during the ball kicking task. And we hypothesized that this was because although the participants were instructed to kick the ball using an in-step pass, as they would pass to an opponent or a teammate, they might have approached the ball differently each time, even though they were instructed to perform the same type of kick. So really, we found that the Blue Trident dual sensor, which had that capacity to capture up to 200 Gs, as Caleb had mentioned previously, was reliable in measuring impact load and step count across the 3 different sessions and during these more functional dynamic tasks. And that really kicking a ball was a little bit more variable. And again, we think that this is likely due to just the inherent variability of performing that specific task. And while this work can serve as a foundation for future research, it definitely is a point that we can use as a step off for other longitudinal studies looking, at these impact load metrics over the course of games or practices, not just a couple movements. And so now I wanted to talk about some of the logistical take-homes and things that, that we thought about in this study, and we thought about when we were trying to plan for the team monitoring study that unfortunately didn't get off the ground, but are important if you're trying to replicate work in teams with IMUs. And so a lot of the stuff that we really had to think about was the IMU placement and the attachment method. So how are we going to affix the IMU? I talked a little bit about the wrap versus using the strap and how that would affect the placement relative to the shin guard. Initially we were worried that the IMU would sit underneath the shin guard and that might be uncomfortable. So, we really went back and forth a lot about how to best affix the IMU so that it, allowed player comfort and flexibility, because a lot of athletes don't necessarily like to wear, external devices if they're uncomfortable or if they feel like they hinder their performances. So definitely sport dependent as well as equipment considerations are very important. And then another thing that came up was some league rules. So whether or not they were able to wear an external, say we used the strap, if they were able to use the strap on the outside of their sock, or whether or not they were able to actually wear this device. So those are all things to consider when you're designing a study that's looking at long-term use of IMUs in athletes and in sports. And just some other limitations that are specific to the study that I just presented is one, these results are specific to the movements that were performed in this study. And if, you extrapolate to other, more dynamics such as jump landing or really, hard landing tasks, the results might be different. So research can look into those areas as well. And additionally, these results are specific to our particular sensor that we used, which was the blue trident, as well as the attachment method. So these are all things to consider, when designing studies going forward. And now I'm going to pass it off to Jeremy, if I can. Sorry, hold on. I lost my stop share.
I might be able to kill it for you, Julie. Give me
Okay, thanks. Sorry. Oh, I got it. Stop share.
Okay.
All right. So thanks, Julie. What I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on the team-based monitoring theme, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our IMU deployments and collegiate basketball athletes. And really the specifics of what I'm going to talk about are kind of the nuts and bolts of our workflow, and really highlight more considerations, some of the challenges, perhaps some recommendations. And then if we have time, I'll show you some of the preliminary data that we've got to date. All right, and so the data that I'm going to present today is part of a grant that we got, Dr. Davis got with collaboration with the NBA and General Electric to study impacts and bone stress injuries in basketball athletes throughout the basketball season. And so the first thing I wanted to really touch on, because in my mind, it's one of the most important things, is personnel. And so we all work at the Spaulding National Running Center, and unfortunately we don't have a basketball team. So that meant that we had to find collection sites. And so the first collection site that I'm going to talk to you about today is actually an hour away, and there was about 18 athletes there. And so there's obviously some logistical considerations around how are we going to actually get in touch with these athletes and get these IMUs on them. So one of the things that you really have to think about is who is in contact with these athletes. And so those are most often the actual team athletic therapists, any of their student athletic therapists, and any current or former student athletes. And so what we did is we were able to leverage some relationships with the athletic therapy staff. So at this site, we had around 1.5 staffing there. And then these last two, the student ATs and the current and former student athletes actually are ideal for a research assistant type personnel. So we were also fortunate enough to be able to hire a research assistant at this site. And so I just really wanted to stress that in order to get even into the room to get IMUs on these athletes in our specific environment, I know in other types of athletic environments, say a professional team setting, this might not be a big issue, but leveraging those individuals that are already integrated into the team is crucial. And the next thing I really wanted to highlight is that, yeah, these are athletes, but in the context of the study, they are volunteers and they are also student athletes. So there's scheduling considerations to think about there. And the athletic staff are also volunteers. And then our research assistant is also a student. So these aren't full-time people working on this. And I wasn't necessarily full-time on this project per se. And they're also volunteers. So just things to consider. And so I'm just going to run through our IMU workflow, and that's just going to include some things about the equipment and the storage, the activation and the assignment of the IMUs, session monitoring, so actually in the session when we're using the IMUs, the retrieval of the IMUs, and then a little bit about the data and upload. And I just want to stress that the details really do matter here in this type of study, and it's really about reducing the burden on the athletes and the athletic therapy staff, and in order to really maintain buy-in from these volunteers in the study. And obviously, the most important thing is to keep data quality high. So in terms of equipment and storage, our collection goals for this study was to get all the players that we could, so we consented all the players, and collect at least 3 sessions a week. And those are comprised of games and practices. So ideally, you know, it's either 2 games in a practice or 2 practices in a game. So what we did is we used the Blue Trident IMUs and the IMU step workflow. And what that results in is that you need about 36 IMUs for all 18 players. We had 3 USB hubs, we had 3 iPads, we had a laptop, this crucial 25-port USB charger, and obviously a power bar. And with all that equipment, you really have to do a good job of finding it at home. And so what we did is we built a little bit of a case. The styrofoam inserts, if anybody has any Blue Tridents or Blue Thunders, are actually really good at holding these. And then I just ripped apart this case and added everything nice and secure. And then you got to think about where you're going to store it. We were lucky enough that our AT room did have a place where we could keep it. We didn't want a research assistant lugging this back and forth to their home. And the last thing is you got to make sure you have access to power, and whether that's in the AT room or in the gym or wherever. There's a lot of equipment here that has a battery, and those batteries need charging. So make sure that's a priority. So in terms of IMU activation and assignment, we did this in the athletic therapy rooms. The athletic therapy room that we had at this specific site was actually extremely small. I think it only had 2 or 3 treatment beds and maybe another little area where the water bottles were filled up. So something to think about there. And this happened, and the activation of the IMUs happened around 30 minutes before the first athlete arrives. And that's different between games and practices. Practices, you could probably get away with 30 minutes if, you know, once you're into the study. But in games, I mean, it really depends on who your athletes are. Some people have some really, you know, ingrained rituals in terms of what time they show up before games. And that also has to do with scheduling. Maybe there's some stuff that the coach wants to see from the athletes before they arrive. So really understanding the scheduling piece is crucial here. And so what we did is we used the same IMUs, and we wanted to put them on the same players, on the same legs. We felt that was important. And one thing that's nice about this is that it's easier to assign and track missing IMUs because you're assigning specific ones to specific players. And so what we ended up doing was labeling each by player, leg, and direction. You can't really see it. Maybe you can on some of these IMUs, but they're all they're all labeled right and left. They have a player ID and then an arrow, so pointing up towards their head. And then on the wall next to the bed, there was actually a list for the AT staff, so they could just look at the list, grab the IMUs, and chuck them on. And during this 30 minutes before the session, the research assistant actually came in and woke all the IMUs up and assigned them in the app beforehand. We found this a lot better workflow than an athlete comes in, okay, let's wake the sensor, let's assign it, yada, yada, yada. What's nice about waking them all up and assigning them is that you can get them back into these trays, get them all set out. And again, it's kind of a lot less burden to the athletic therapy staff to tape them in. And then obviously iMeasureU has this really nice knock feature, which makes this fairly quick to do, especially when you have 36 sensors firing up on your Bluetooth list. This makes it really easy to identify those ones which you want to activate. So in terms of attachment, obviously we've talked about it a little bit already so far today, but we did choose to tape it in for all the sessions. And this is a little bit around, we did collect during games and practices. And so in games, we wanted to make sure the IMU was tucked away and didn't want to cause any issues there. We incorporated it into ankle taping if subjects were getting ankle tapes, or we used a single band, and that was mostly a little bit of elastic cover roll or power flex with some athletic tape. Some of the athletes did find that there was a little bit of abrasion of the plastic side of the IMU onto their skin. So if there was complaints around that, what we did is just apply a little bit of pre-wrap if needed, and that actually helped quite a bit. And one consideration here is just tape budget. Not all athletes get taped every single game. So if you're a smaller school, or if your site is a smaller school with a smaller budget, this actually does drastically increase some of the budget considerations. So just something to think about there. And then in terms of placement, again, we wanted to make things easy for the ATs to tape these in. And so what we use as a rule, because of low cut and high cut footwear, is that we found we could get away with a 1 IMU width above the medial malleoli. And that just really helped with being consistent with placement, which I think was most important for us. And then there were some issues around braces, because some athletes do wear ankle braces. So what we had to do is, for those people, we put them up above the brace, so that we didn't feel like the brace was hitting the IMU at all. But again, if those athletes did sometimes wear braces, we wanted to kind of get that IMU in the same place every time. And one thing I want to point out is that I mentioned that we only had 1 and a bit AT staff for every session, every game or practice. And this actually increased the load on them quite a bit. Again, not every single player comes in to get treatment, or at least not all at once like this. And oftentimes we had players waiting, like outside the AT room, waiting to get in to get taped. And this also comes back to reminders, because we didn't do every single session. So communicating to the players what days we are going to collect and what days you aren't. It's really crucial to have somebody who's integrated in the team. Thankfully, our AT staff was great, and our research assistant was great at doing this. So in terms of session monitoring, we have to, obviously, once we get the IMUs on, we then go up to the session to be able to monitor it. And so we needed to get the permission from the RA to actually see practices. So, I mean, some schools would be a little bit protective over this, perhaps. Again, having a known face within the community is very helpful here. And then we wanted to get it close to the court as possible for best connectivity with the iPads. The new Bluetooth and the new Blue Tridents are actually quite good. Early on, we had a little bit of hiccups, but things got really good close to the end. And something to consider in terms of games, if you have access to being close to the court. And then something that was really crucial for us was really just a basic pen and paper session log. It's always good to have backups for footnotes. So start and end of practice, start and end of the half. And then if players were late or injured, or if there was misassignments in IMUs, which happens. So sometimes you go to wake an IMU and you don't know why it's not waking up, and you don't have time to fix it because you're trying to get players taped. So we would just assign them a spare IMU if we had to, and then we would have to make sure we noted that for later. And then one thing that I found extremely valuable after the fact was having video. It serves as a really good triple backup. So I can kind of understand, and it does provide a bit more context to the data when I'm looking at it in terms of footnotes and what's happening. So I was, luckily the school did put up their videos publicly, but one suggestion I would have is maybe if you could have your own version of video, maybe sync it, Unix timestamp or something, so that you can actually sync it a little bit to the IMUs. And the last thing I want to note is make sure your iPad time is correct. Because everything has batteries, we try and make an effort to shut things down. And there was a couple times when we fired the iPads back up, and if we were in a hurry, the time zone actually changed, and then that would change the time zone on some of the IMUs and not others. So then we were getting confused why practices started earlier or later, or games. So just something to keep an eye on there. So in terms of retrieval, again, arguably one of the more important pieces. We asked the players to return to the AT room. Ideally, we probably would have got them as they're walking off the court, but then you just have these clumps of players trying to get the tape off. So I would suggest you have lots of these tape sharks that players can just easily and quickly just rip those things off. We did have our collection trays set out. Players, as the study got on, got really good at just kind of, throwing them in the trays themselves, which was great. But also keep note, they got to check the garbage. Tape is sticky. The IMUs stick to the tape, and sometimes, things happen. So if you're looking for that random IMU somewhere, the first place I would check is definitely the garbage. And then again, players' schedules, having an understanding of their schedules. There was days where we'd be waiting in the AT room for the players to get back, and they never came back after practice. And this is because they had either lift or video right after. And many of the players, their routine is just practice, go to lift, practice, go to video. You're not going to make the coach wait for you to come back to the AT room and cut these out. So just communication around that is also crucial. And then have a backup plan. So luckily enough, our RA was actually quite familiar enough with the team. He was able to just, run into the dressing room and get IMUs if we were, waiting around for like one or two players to come back to the AT room. And it's really nice to get these IMUs in as soon as possible. And this obviously helps so we can start uploading and charging the IMUs. So in terms of data upload, we didn't disconnect the IMUs from the app in the iPad until they were physically within our hands and close enough to the iPads. And we felt this really helped with ending the sessions and making sure the footnotes saved. And then we just started getting to it in terms of downloading and uploading. So we did have a laptop right there in the AT room. It did have internet. It was Wi-Fi. Looking back, maybe we could have tried to do something like Ethernet. That'll definitely help a little bit with your upload speeds. We used a bunch of USB hubs. And then at one point, we ended up just getting a second laptop. Our RA used his laptop actually, because he just found using two laptops uploading at the same time with multiple USB hubs was the quickest way to get all this done as soon as possible. And you can tell there's lots of stuff going on here with cables and power and things. So important to be tidy. And then this is the point where you really, really want to check your footnotes and your assignments or anything weird that you want to know, because once it's up in IMU step, it can be a bit difficult to sort all that out. So this is the time where you really want to make sure you're assigning the right IMUs to the right players and cropping any type of data that you want to crop. And so I just want to note that all in all, on average, I looked at the timesheets and it's about 6.5 hours. I'd probably lean a little bit longer than that. And that's from when the RA comes in to start by waking up the sensors to, packing, or at least that last IMU getting uploaded and processed in IMU step, and then putting everything away, making sure it's locked up. So these are long days. And you can imagine if you're trying to do this every single day, that having people dedicated to this is probably the way to go, but just something to consider in terms of total session time. And so in terms of preliminary data, like I said, everything we uploaded in IMU step, and that was, great because it just has everything up in one spot. And then in order for us to answer some of our primary research questions, we did find that we need to do some raw exports from the dashboard, and then we loaded it up into R just to do some more data wrangling and a little bit of the corrections that I was talking to you about, where I had to go back and rewatch some of the games, which was fun. So in total, we had 29 total sessions, over 916 hours worth of data, over 3 million individual steps. And this plot just kind of shows during the season where these sessions took place. So we had 9 games in this teal color and 20 in red. And they were just kind of dotted as we went. There was obviously some clusters and lack of data collections around the holidays. And then, just something to consider about when and where you're able to actually get those collections, and maybe how you want to spread that out as much as you can. Because we did only do home games here, I think I forgot to mention. So we didn't travel with the team. So that also kind of changes up your schedule. And then in terms of sessions per player, on average, we had 23 total sessions per player, about 6 games and about 17 practices. And so this figure here just kind of shows every single player. So from player 7 to 18, sorted from most data to least data. Collected sessions are in the light blue, and then missing data is in this dark navy blue. And as you can see, as the season goes on from the start to the end of the season, we do tend to see a little bit of attrition, especially with certain people. And that's just something to consider. Important to keep buy-in, and it's important to understand how well the team is doing, because sometimes that can result in subject fatigue. But if you just look at some of these blocks of missing data, it's actually because they're either injured, or we had a couple athletes that failed off earlier on in the season. So that's why that data is missing. And so some of the work that we're doing right now is to answer some of our primary aims. And that's specifically looking at some cumulative impact loading metrics. And so what we're looking at is games versus practice, start versus the end of the season, and start games, and then start versus the end of the season, and also how this might relate to injury. So just quickly here, this graph is just a density plot that shows the step intensities, all step intensities up to 100 Gs. And what you can really tell is that in practices, you have a larger amount of densities of impacts that are considered maybe low. Whereas in games, we have this a little bit of a fatter tail, which suggests that there's more higher intensity steps during the games. So this work is underway, and we're planning to do some descriptive study on this right now. And then in addition to that, we're working with our collaborators at Auckland, so Dr. Tor Bezier and Alex Woodall, and what we're doing is we're doing some risk modeling for bone stress injuries. So at the end of the season, I actually was able to bring in some of the basketball players from the team, and we did some full body 3D motion capture with EMG to do some musculoskeletal modeling, which we're going to map and do some muscle force modeling to do, and then do some geometry and finite element analysis. And then we also have all the IMU data. So then what we can do is start to predict, do some tissue failure properties similar to some of the work that they do in Calgary with Brent. And what's also interesting is that we do have all the season's data, so then we can chuck that into a model like this as well, and see how their risk for bone stress changes over the season. And with that, I think we're done. So I'll just say thank you to everybody for listening, and I'll pass it over to James at the moment.
Thanks, guys. Really good presentations. We've got a few questions, and just to remind everyone, if you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A section on the bottom, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I think this first question is for Caleb. The question is, what was the definition of a good versus bad peak when you were trying to take out the bad peaks?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So essentially, I guess by bad peaks, the two main things we're talking about are either artifact peaks, again, which mostly come from the sensor getting knocked on something, where you essentially get a peak that's not, possible just from a running stride. And then the second one is where you get inaccurately identified peaks. So we have essentially, our method to identify peaks. It runs automatically, and it separates out what it thinks are generally stride windows, and then identifies the peaks within each of those stride windows. And depending on what method you use, you sometimes, misidentify what is a peak. And so that's essentially what I mean by bad peaks. I guess if you're talking about the ways of kind of handling that and going through automatically and trying to correct for those bad peaks, you essentially identify bad peaks as anything that's outside of your range, whatever method you're using.
Cool. I think this is along the same lines for that same study. Ryan asks, has the method of the sliding median/mean been validated? Yeah, not that I know of, not formally. I can tell you that just anecdotally, I've done a little bit of work looking at this because I was curious essentially as to how much it mattered if we just, like I said, use this kind of blunt way of going through and throwing out peaks. And so I used some other data from another study that I've been involved with, where we're collecting data outside for relatively long periods of time. I went through and used a moving median method to remove peaks, and then also went through those same trials and manually identified, those peaks that were incorrectly identified or artifact peaks and fixed them myself. And I found that, over the when you're averaging over the number of strides that you would be if you're collecting this amount of data, it essentially doesn't matter. If you use, the
if you go through and take the time to correct every single peak yourself, or if you just use a method like a moving median.
Yeah, I think something to keep in mind is that the newer sensors record at 1600 hertz. So if you're recording a marathon, that is just a ton and a ton of data. So you might drive yourself crazy if you're going through every single peak. So I know in most of your presentations, you talked about alternative methods of attachment. Would you be able to share any research on the validity of the different attachment methods?
Caleb, will let you.
I could take that one too. Yeah, we just finished up a study on that actually. We compared using just the straps that come with the iMeasureU sensors to using something similar to what Jeremy and Julie presented on. Just some combination of athletic tape, and in this case, we used an elastic wrap over top of the athletic tape as well to what we think is more tightly secure into the leg. And we found that on average, the peaks were about 1 G lower using the more secure attachment. But the correlations to vertical load rates were similar between the two attachment methods. We're not really sure why that is, but essentially our interpretation is if you really are interested in the most kind of accurate representation of the tibial accelerations, peak accelerations directly after foot contact, that using kind of a more secure attachment method might be better.
Okay, so this question's for Jeremy. Did the practice and game collection time vary enough to make note of it?
I mean, yeah, a little bit. Obviously, if there was games or practices right before games, they weren't the super long, intense practices. So those ones were definitely shorter. They varied. It was funny if you actually compared games versus practices, games were obviously a bit more reliable in their terms of length because there's a clock and there's referees and there's a time slot. Whereas with the practice, it did end up always being on the discretion of the coach, how long they wanted to go and what they wanted to do. So again, that was just something we just had to roll with because we weren't necessarily in the know in terms of this was going to be a short or long practice. So we were always just prepared for it to be a longer session, but they definitely did vary across the season for sure.
Cool. So probably, I think this question might be for Jeremy, but after your research, what are your thoughts on the future of IMUs in sport?
I think there's a lot that we can learn from them. I think, the study with the basketball that we've done, there hasn't been a lot of work done yet wearing tibial mounted accelerometers bilaterally in games and practices quite yet. So I think there's a lot to do in terms of nailing down the collection, but then also what types of insights we want to gain from it. And there's a lot of different lenses people look at that. We look at it from an injury perspective. So we're obviously most interested in trying to use this type of information to see how we can predict, injury, specifically in this study, stress fracture injury. And so some of the work that we're doing with the group from Auckland and Tor, I think is very promising. Obviously the limitation with that is that you have to get some really in-depth biomechanical data first to be able to do that type of research. Whereas some of the more probabilistic methods of, using the IMU is just a way to understand the number of steps, and then using models of tissue failure is also another way that I think is promising. But I think they're both going to be very valuable from an injury perspective. The performance piece I'm not as familiar with, so I probably won't comment on that too much. But I still think a lot of it has to do with what we found from the Boston Marathon study, is that there's just so much data, and that there's a lot of decisions to be made about how you want to cut it up and how you want to look at it. So I think really, we're just beginning to really understand that. And what we can do is just leverage what has already been done in the past in terms of other external monitoring systems, GPS and things like that, and see if there's gaps that this type of system or these types of systems can fill. So I think there's just still tons of work that we can do, especially from the research community, to really make use of all this data that we're collecting.
Yeah, definitely. Julie, do you have any thoughts on that after working with soccer?
So unfortunately, because we didn't actually get to work with our soccer team because of COVID, I definitely think that the study that we were planning on doing was going to look at the metrics that we get out of IMU STEP and see whether or not that might correlate with actual blood biomarkers across the season. And I think that that would have been a very interesting study to see whether or not, across the season, during different periods of training, greater duration, greater load, does that actually influence, how does that influence the biomarkers, especially related to like cartilage breakdown, and whether or not the IMUs were able to correlate with some of those metrics, because I think it would, if that was the case, I think it would be a great tool to be able to use for individuals that don't necessarily have the ability to do serial blood draws or, on larger teams, because that just is it's a big burden. So I think that in the future, that would be an interesting thing to flesh out.
Okay. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you or keep up with the research that you guys are doing, what's the best way to kind of follow your new research?
Yeah, obviously we have a website, which is runsnrc.org. Julie and I have Twitter. The center does have Twitter as well. And I think it's at runsnrc, I think. But the other thing you can do is obviously check out Dr. Davis's ResearchGate page and things like that, because all of the new publications get put up there. But you can also reach out to us at any time, either myself, Caleb or Julie. And I think we can provide our contact information after this.
Great. Yeah, I think that's probably all the time we have for today. So if we didn't get to your questions, we'll be following up after the presentation, and then remember that you will be getting the recording of this when you're done. So just wanted to say thank you again to all of our presenters. Some really good info there. And thank you for everyone that attended. So hopefully everyone has a good day.
Thanks, James.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.